Hey everybody, it's Kelly. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. This week you're about to see part one of a two-part series based in purity culture from a man's perspective. Real quick content warning, you'll hear a little more about it in a minute, but we do get kind of heavy into religious topics. And if that is triggering for you, I would encourage you to either take a pass or watch this with someone who is a safe person for you, just in case some things come up. Hope you enjoy it. Next week, you'll see part two. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. I'm Kelly, and I am here with two of my good friends. We are going to talk to you about the topic of purity culture from a man's perspective. So those of you who are watching the channel for a while, you know that most of my stuff is from a female and non-binary perspective, which I stand by, but that's not the only perspectives out there. So I have heard what you have asked, and we have two people who are willing to share what their experience has been. Just a reminder for anybody out there who's watching, who is currently experiencing religious trauma, we will talk about religion and we will talk about God. If that is not your thing right now, if that's not something that you can listen to, it's okay to skip this video. We don't mind. Take care of yourselves. But I hope that if you do decide to listen, that you listen understanding that everyone's experience is different, and this in no way should dictate your experience. We're sharing our experiences, simple as that. We're going to go first up here to Kevin. Will you introduce yourself and tell us who you are, a little bit about yourself, and how you've experienced purity culture?
That's a lot. So my name is Kevin Johnson. I'm a pastor down in Hollywood, Florida, at Hollywood Hills United Methodist Church. I've been married just over 19 years, and my wife and I only have 5 kids. I grew up in the 90s, and so I was exposed to purity culture kind of all through middle school, high school, church youth group, and then even in public school systems. I think my hope for this conversation is to be able to speak more about the effects of purity culture and kind of how to fix it.
I'm Britt, and I am currently a middle school teacher just north of Tampa, Florida. And I have been in and around Christian and church culture for a long time. I actually was a youth director for the last almost 17 years. So with all the things that involves, as well as growing up in the 80s and 90s, actually, it's fun. I get to be the youngest person here, so
You are.
But I went, through the church youth group phase. I went to a rather conservative Christian university or college, and then straight into ministry life. And I am single and in my later 30s, and so I think I am in a somewhat unique perspective between my other friends here, as somebody who's been single and also in somewhat of a purity culture spotlight, if you will, being a single man, as a youth worker and in a kind of somewhat prominent light in the churches that I've been a part of. This conversation I've heard so often and championed, I hope, the conversation to free other people from the grips of what purity culture did to them, and recognizing that our culture in many ways has been focused towards men in some way or another. It's not often been, at least in my experience, often been talked about the damage that can happen to men and the things that purity culture either directly or indirectly teaches men. I hope to undo some of that damage, and in all real honesty, I'm still working through a lot of this stuff in my own life as I try and figure out what it means to be a man and how that is both a good thing, a thing to be celebrated, and undoing some of those wounds, like you said.
One of the things that we have all talked about is the freedom and the permission giving that happens for people who have had it clearly, obviously, overtly unfair in these situations. It's hard sometimes to give yourself the permission if you don't count yourself in that category. Just to bring everybody on the same page, could you each give me a definition for purity culture as you would define it?
I think I would define purity culture as that culture as far as coming from a conservative Christian standpoint, and it basically saying that everyone had to remain 100% pure for marriage, and they were protecting themselves and saving themselves for this perfect later relationship. And that culture, it seeped into everything. And I remember youth group, church camp, all those things. At some point, there was some kind of purity conversation that happened, and they would always split the boys and the girls. And, it's a big nebulous thing, but I think there's so many pieces of it that everybody that went through it, like as soon as you mentioned just that one little thing about it, everybody's like, yeah, I remember that. I remember that.
How about you, Kevin? How would you define purity culture?
So to me, purity culture is this conservative Christian, or as I experienced it, just Christianity in general in the 90s, directed at young people, middle school and high school, just realizing that they are sexual beings, that you are made in the image of God, that you are so special that you have to keep yourself pure. And there are so many things out there that can make you impure. And if you do any of those things, then you are no longer pure and no longer as good. You don't have as much worth. And so it was both a you individual purity and maintaining the purity for others. You had to dress a certain way or stay, a certain distance apart. Middle school church dances make room for the Holy Spirit. It is a contradiction in
you are beautiful and wonderful and you have to stay pure.
And
everything around you is telling you not to be pure.
And you need to fight all of those urges.
Even though those urges are God-given,
they're not what you should be feeling right now.
Sounds like a pretty intense mixed message. People who are still trying to figure themselves out. So in that vein, I want to ask both of you, how did the messages you got in purity culture influence your understanding of yourself? Kevin wants to go first on this one. Okay, go for it.
So purity culture messed me up. Because it was this contradiction in messages.
That sex was good and sex was a beautiful gift, and sex is something that God designed for two people in a loving marriage to participate in.
But just not now.
So sex is great, but not yet. And anything that approaches or gets close to or even hints at is inherently wrong and gross and nasty, like all of these visceral things. I remember conversations, and as problematic as it sounds now as I'm saying it back to us,
girls are this special jewel that have to be protected.
And then
guys, you shouldn't go around trying to defile other people's jewels.
So there was this like ownership of it. And I had a conversation with a good friend of mine that it seemed to me that purity culture in the 90s said that if you were not pure, then your physical body, for females, your physical body is something wrong. You're wearing not the right clothes or not enough clothes or whatever. All of those victim blaming, how you're dressing, how you're acting, all of those things. So your body is impure, is not right. To boys, the way that your brain is working is that you're thinking impure thoughts. And so who you are on the inside, your desires, your wishes, your urges, all of those things are wrong, are gross, are nasty. I will say how it's affected me. Just this past year, I spoke at a camp for I think it was like fifth and sixth graders around that age. And it was talking about kind of the intersection of Christian faith and human sexuality. And I had all of these scars and this damage of being told my whole life that sex is wrong. And then at some point during your marriage ceremony, all of a sudden it's not just okay, but now it's like ordained by God. And so I go into this and I'm talking to these kids, and I will say I'm ashamed of it now, but I had these 4th and 5th grade kids chanting, "Sex is good. Sex is good." And then I like unpack that of like, not right now. Like you need to be in a committed covenant relationship. And, we kind of talk through that, but it focused too much on preaching from my wounds of the harmfulness of purity culture and not from it is a beautiful gift.
How about you, Britt? How do you feel like purity culture has shaped your sense of self?
There's so many like facets to it, and so many pieces that I to this day and still like kind of bouncing off of what Kevin said, that message that I kind of internalize of everything inside of you, whatever your brain does and says, that quick look that you're doing. That is wrong. You are broken. You're not a good Christian because you looked. You shouldn't even have that desire. The best Christians don't even have those desires until they're allowed to in marriage. And oh, by the way, my super hot smoking wife is sorry, I know that's one for you, Kelly, but that's I mean, man, I cannot tell you how it is so getting messed up to tell a boy in middle school starts to realize that they have these feelings of sexuality
and noticing stuff, and then to have a man who they look up to as this epitome of what it means to be a Christian, to say first, oh, by the way, any impure thought you have makes you evil and wrong and disgusting and ugly and messy.
And oh, by the way, here, let me bring up my smoking hot wife.
Only when you're worthy, only when you're the best kind of Christian, does God somehow reward you with this perfect, ideal mate who is not only smoking hot, but just wants to have sex with you all the time. And that's okay to talk about now because I'm a married man and I can talk about it.
But you're not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to think about it. Because if you do, you'll never get pissed.
As something that I've only really begun to truly unpack is what that did to me in singleness. And how I still have to regularly unpack that and go, you know, I'm single and I'm actually really quite happy with being single. And I also look back at the time I've spent in ministry and recognize that I could not have done what I did in ministry had I not been single. And that was a gift. That was a gift in its own crazy way. Even now, I still struggle with this idea of like, well, if I had been the best I could have been or had been pure inside, then I would have been given this thing. I would have gotten that, you know, that ultimate gift. And so that has been just so difficult to unpack. There's this other side of purity culture for men that, and Kevin kind of alluded this too, where women are these jewels or these prizes to be won. There's a damsel in a tower and I'm to save her and win this battle and be this kind of person. There's also this idea of protection and not being the predator, not being the bad guy. Like there's this extra piece of, well, if I had that impure thought about my sister in Christ, am I the predator? Am I the bad guy?
I've got to get out of here. I've got to dunk myself in the Jordan 7 times to clean off 7 times, 77 times.
Constant fear of, am I the bad guy? And how can I not be the bad guy? And how can I make sure that I'm showing respect at every stage? Oh, but also I have to show intent, but not intent. And there's this back and forth. And like you said, Kevin, just cluster of just mismatched signals that don't ever seem to line up.
One of my favorite encounters, and by favorite, I mean most scarring and damaging encounters as a youth, was the quote of Jesus. You've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I say unto you, if you look at somebody lustfully, our leader at the time said, if you look at somebody lustfully, you're raping them. And do you really want to rape your brother or sister in Christ? And so, I mean, like, just very...
It's got lust and incest all in one fell swoop.
One big punch.
Well done.
And I would have these agonizing conversations and thoughts with leaders of, okay, so where's the line between appreciating beauty and raping in my mind? Like those seem real close. And am I allowed to find somebody attractive without becoming lustful? It still messes with me. The damage that purity culture did and the inability to talk about sex, to have frank conversations. I hope my kids don't ever watch this, but I have always been open. I've always just asked them questions, and I've always been very open and honest and clear as I can be. And my mindset is, it's not awkward unless I make it awkward, that they won't know how uncomfortable I am if I don't say I'm uncomfortable. And so I talk to my kids about everything under the sun, including sexuality, including bodies, including all of that. I'm getting used to it. It was very difficult years ago when we first started having kids.
Specifically self-love. So we talked about self and understanding of self, but in the loving of yourself, which, let's be real, is a hard thing for us to do anyway. If it was easy, I might not have a job. So here we are. And how did that impact your understanding of your worthiness of love and your worthiness to love yourself? If you have all these messages about the evilness and the dirtiness and the vileness of just your brains as a whole, like, how do you love yourself after that and accept love in return?
I mean, I think that has been one of the things, one of those pieces that I've been really trying to unpack really in the last couple of years, because, and it's a combination of more than just purity culture. I think it's a combination of that part of Christian culture that tells us we're broken and in need of a savior and in need of something, and we're not really worthy. And that's really not super scriptural, for one. And it's, for me, as someone who has taught people and taught students and young people this kind of stuff, I realized that my language towards them has been, loving and grace-filled for years of my ministry. And yet, for some reason, my language toward myself about worthiness still doesn't really hit that. We are the only person inside our heads that, like, I was so free to point out to people that God loved them no matter where they came from and what had happened and what they had done or thought about doing or any of that stuff. And yet, when that same time would kind of, the light or the mirror would kind of point towards me, I would have all these negative things to say about myself, because I knew those dark places in the recesses of my spirit that harbored these other feelings and these dark things that, I'm not supposed to feel this way or think this way, but, they're there. They don't go anywhere. You just kind of have to push them back and hide them and say,
well, they're not real.
Keep them hidden. And I think knowing those inner parts of myself and having that kind of cassette tape, understanding that I'm a worthy person, is a constant struggle. I often find that my bad days are the days that I listen to these old Christian voices in my life that said,
you need this, you're broken, you need this, without this, you're nothing.
You have no worth outside of what God has given you.
Those aren't the words of God. The ones that I've read, for sure.
First of all, I didn't think that I would be going to a therapy session that was recorded on Zoom and put out all over YouTube. Yeah. So when you asked that question, it really hit me, because I've never thought of that before. And what has been running through my mind is, as Brene Brown says, the difference between guilt and shame. And that I mean, I do stupid things all the time, and I do things that I wish I wouldn't all the time. And I mean, it's just part of who I am. And I do feel guilty that, those things happen. But shame is the emotion, is the feeling that is wrapped around anything about sexuality. That it is not that I'm a person that did a bad thing, but that I'm a bad person. I make a distinction that we are not inherently bad people, that we are people that do dumb things. And I say often that as a United Methodist pastor, I'm in the United Methodist Church for a reason, and that's because we start with, there's nothing you can do to make God love you any more than God already does right now. And I hold on to that, and I love that. And I didn't realize until you asked that question that I feel shame going back as long as I can remember for any thoughts that I had. Purity culture has caused me to feel shame about something that God designed to be wonderful. And that ticks me off. That even at 41, I still have shame wrapped around things of sex. And that shouldn't be. That's, it's, and maybe that's why I'm so passionate about teaching the next generation that, no, that's not how it is. That's not how it should be, because I don't want them raised with shame. I want them to understand that it is a beautiful, wonderful gift. Nothing to be shameful about.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I think for a lot of the people who are going to watch this, specifically subscribers of my channel, a lot of them are carrying a lot of religious trauma also. So I'm hoping that what they're hearing from the both of you is also that there are also people in religious communities that are fighting against the things that are causing trauma to people, and fighting against having that continue over and over and over again. And because no one deserves to have that kind of shame, that kind of pain put on them just for existing. You know, we're existing, we're doing what we can. And to be shamed for that really would call into question, for I think most people, the love of the God they're trying to follow and the acceptance of the community that they're committing to.
Thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I hope this was as valuable for you as it was for us to film. Next week will be part 2. I hope you find your way back here for that. Please go ahead and drop a comment and let me know what you thought. Respond to any of the things that you heard, or ask questions that you maybe want us to address in the future. I'll see you again next week. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.